this a fantastic occasion or what? I mean, there is so much electricity and warmth and friendship and community in this room. And how often do I get to follow a woman governor? You, please, Barbara, come to New York State and, and educate. I really came mainly to say thank you. It's always clear to me that us outside agitators, whatever it is you want to call us, are mainly an excuse for you to get together and discover you don't need us in the first place. You know, you have all the energy and outrageous ideas and organizing tactics you could possibly need right here in this room. So my thank you is for you individually and for you as the YWCA collectively. There is no organization on earth that I am aware of that is as much a symbol of what we are working for in the future as the YWCA. I always think to myself, if there is one group that I would trust to run the world, think about it. It definitely would be the YWCA. Clearly, if the YWCA ran the world, we would have national systems of child care and health care everywhere, including in this country, which is the only advanced democracy without that. No doubt the military budget would be given to schools, and the school budget would be given to the military. The emphasis of foreign aid would be exactly the same as Yolanda House. Just read what Yolanda House does. It's absolutely everything we need to do in foreign policy and foreign aid. The goal of leadership would be creating independence, not dependence. And you would do all of this with less money. I mean, the YWCA has to get along with less money than the YMCA and does it all. I'm not advocating that this situation continue. I'm just observing that you know how to do it. I have been assigned to discuss in 30 minutes the progression, the future of feminism. This is like saying describe the universe and give 2 examples. So I've arbitrarily selected just really 3 or 4. But I think it is maybe helpful to situate us in history a little bit, because the form that opposition to the women's movement takes these days is to say it's over. You know, first they say, our opposition, whoever they are, said it wasn't necessary, it was against nature, God, Freud, someone. Then when we did it anyway, for all these years, now the opposition says, well, it used to be necessary, but it's not anymore. So I think it helps to remember that the entire first wave, as we wrongly count our history in this country because we count it from the first European arrival, but the entire first wave took 100 years to gain a legal identity as human beings for women of all races and men of color, to be able to own property rather than being property. A century was devoted to achieving legal identity. Now we are probably in another century devoted to achieving legal equality. And I think that's important to understand, because movements seem to have to last at least a century to have an indelible imprint on the cultures to come. So if we're 30 or 40 years into this wave, I don't know how to break it to you today, but I figure we have about 40 years to go. And there probably will be other waves in the future before we finally achieve the goal of being regarded as both unique individuals and equal members of the human family. We can't know exactly what the future barriers will be. but clearly we are still dealing with the problems, the caste problems, the birth-based problems of sex and race and ethnicity and sexuality, and we're on our way to uniqueness. But even if you just consider this wave, I think we can see some clear progressions. For instance, in the beginning, we were dealing with equal pay. I mean, that was known as the part I agree with, you know. We've moved towards it. As you know, obviously, we've moved from 59 cents on the dollar to, depending on the part of the country you're in, some 60 to more than 80 cents on the dollar, but we're not there yet, okay? So equal pay came first, then came comparable worth, because we figured out that equal pay didn't mean much, you know, in the pink-collar ghetto, where nurses, waitresses, mainly female occupations, were being compared to each other. So we started to compare them to comparably trained men's occupations, nurses to pharmacists, for instance, and so on. So there was equal pay, there was comparable worth. And now I think where we need to go, and we have not yet begun to go, is to consider an attributed value to all productive work. Because right now, the enormous work of raising and socializing baby humans, of human support in the home, of subsistence farming, there are all kinds of productive work in this country and in the world that are not yet valued. In this country, that work, mainly but not only in the home, mainly 90% but not only done by women, is a third of all productive work in this country. That's huge. And yet it has no economic value, sometimes doesn't even have a verbal value, since we still talk about women who don't work. Homemakers happen to work longer hours, harder than any other class of worker in the United States, with more incidents of violence, of addiction, of, you know, I hope all of us in this room will now be able to say women who work outside the home and women who work inside the home. But that's not enough. Verbal recognition is not enough, though it's good to end semantic slavery. It is no less than semantic slavery to talk about women who don't work. Hello, right? But if we simply attribute at replacement level a value to the work that 90% women do, we can easily make that tax deductible if we pay taxes. Not difficult, there are attributed values for all kinds of things in the budget. Make it tax deductible from our taxes, or if we're too poor to pay taxes, then tax refundable. And we have won the issue of refundability in our income tax code. We could do that. It's not hard. It would substitute for the disaster of welfare reform. And now think what it would mean economically, in our lives, in our culture, in our sense of fair play and value, just to do that one thing, just to go from equal pay to comparable worth to attributed value. Not hard, and we can do this, But we need to state it as a goal, move toward it. We need to understand that other countries are far ahead of us in this regard. Even our neighbor Canada, in their Statistics Canada National Survey, attributes a value to work in the home, which we don't. That's really because the homemakers of Canada rebelled and said, sorry, I'm not putting down my occupation as a homemaker until you value it. So, you know, we need to rebel, not only full-time homemakers, but everybody who does this work. So that's just one, I think, very practical and possible example of the progression of feminism. We still, a second one has to do with imagery, but I think it's really important in our minds, because our image, even if we don't think about it consciously, is hierarchy or a pyramid. And that is how we measure our accomplishment, and we look with the grid we put on society. I think we have to begin to put a grid of the circle, the way you're sitting. on our society. Because the truth of the matter is we are not ranked, we are linked. And that is crucial also when we think of ourselves as a women's movement. The media and the public consciousness treats the women's movement as separate from the civil rights movement, as separate from the gay and lesbian movement, as separate from the environmental movement. We had a great and I think destructive dose of this during the presidential campaign when sex and race were presented as opposed, even in two people, both of whom were feminists and both of whom were civil rights advocates, thus rendering invisible most of the women in the world who are affected by both sex and race. It was the single most disheartening and divisive thing, it seemed to me, in the campaign because it was not named. Now, the truth of the matter is that all of the movements are connected, and one can't succeed unless the other one succeeds. If you consider what's necessary to continue racism in a deep, long-term anthropological sense, it is controlling women's bodies as the means of reproduction. You can't have racism unless you have some degree of visible difference. And much of the lawmaking in this country, indeed most of it historically, has been devoted to keeping white women separate so they will continue the white race, and to penalizing, indeed it's the single most penalized thing in this country's history, any contact between men of color and white women. That was actually more penalized than that we support an end to both these caste systems. It's practical. It is not possible to be a feminist without being an anti-racist. It just isn't possible. And it's not possible. It's not possible to be a successful anti-racist without being a feminist. What are you going to do, leave half of your group behind? I don't think so. And also, even if you do, you're going to continue racism. So these things are inextricably linked. All right, now let's think about the gay and lesbian movement. That's supposed to be a separate movement. Although I have to say that on campuses, I often get this bewildered, wonderful question, which is, why is the right wing both against lesbians and birth control? And I have to say that it's logical. Hello, our adversary is logical. Because the definition of patriarchy is controlling reproduction, making sure that it ends in conception so there are ever more workers and soldiers and so on, and they are properly owned in systems of marriage.